Europe in the early 20th century was a continent perched on the edge of catastrophe. The streets of Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and Belgrade were alive with industrial progress. Yet beneath the surface, political, social, and military tensions festered. The nations of Europe were not merely neighbors. They were rivals bound together by intricate alliances, rivalries, and ambitions that could, and would, ignite a conflagration unlike any the world had ever seen. The Great World War I did not begin with a single act. It was the inevitable outcome of decades of nationalist fervor, militarization, and imperial competition. To understand why the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 triggered a global war, one must first trace the roots of the continent's most explosive tensions. By 1900, nationalism had become a dominant force in Europe. In Germany, unified only in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, nationalism was both a unifying and aggressive force. The German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II from 1888, sought to assert its position on July 5 to 6, 1914, Austro-Hungary received what became known as the blank check from Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II assured Emperor Franz Joseph of Germany's unconditional support should Austria-Hungary choose to act against Serbia. This pledge emboldened the Austro-Hungarian leadership, particularly Chief of the General Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, who had long advocated for a preemptive strike against Serbia. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, delivered on July 23, 1914, contained 10 stringent demands: suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda, dismissal of officials deemed hostile, permission for Austro-Hungarian involvement in Serbian investigations, and a guarantee of no subversive activities against the empire. Although Serbia accepted 9 of the 10 demands, it balked at the Austro-Hungarian involvement in internal investigations, offering a partial compromise. Austria-Hungary interpreted this as insufficient, setting the stage for war. The delicate balance of alliances ensured that a localized conflict could not remain localized. Russia, a self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, began partial mobilization on July 29, 1914, and ordered full mobilization against Austria-Hungary on July 30th, wary that hesitation would allow Vienna to crush Serbia before Moscow could respond. Germany, observing Russia's mobilization, regarded it as an existential threat. In the German military's view, war was inevitable if Russia continued to move troops toward the Austrian border. On July 31st, Kaiser Wilhelm II sent an ultimatum to Russia demanding the cessation of mobilization. When the ultimatum was ignored, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. On the same day, France, allied with Russia under the Franco-Russian alliance, began mobilizing in anticipation of conflict with Germany. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's military blueprint for a two-front war, dictated that France must be swiftly defeated before turning full attention to Russia, which was assumed to be slower in mobilization. This plan hinged on rapid movement through neutral Belgium to outflank French defenses. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and initiated the invasion through Belgium, violating its neutrality guaranteed by the 1839 Treaty of London. Britain, bound by treaty obligations and alarmed at the prospect of a German-dominated Western Europe, issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of German troops from Belgium. Germany ignored the ultimatum, and on August 4, 1914, Britain declared war, bringing the conflict fully into the global stage. While political leaders maneuvered, the general populations were swept up in nationalist fervor. Across Europe, governments painted their adversaries as existential threats. In Germany, newspapers celebrated the potential for a quick, decisive victory. In France, a revival of patriotism emerged, framed as a defense against centuries-old German aggression. In Britain, the threat to Belgium, viewed as an innocent nation, galvanized public support for intervention. Even in Russia, the narrative of defending Slavic brethren justified full mobilization, despite internal unrest and economic strain. Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, just days after the ultimatum's partial rejection. Mobilization orders cascaded across the continent, activating pre-drafted military plans that were designed for speed and precision but allowed little room for diplomatic adjustment. Germany's Schlieffen Plan required precise timetables. Rapid movement of the German First and Second Armies through Belgium and Luxembourg to encircle Paris and force French capitulation before Russian forces could fully engage. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary attacked from the south, aiming to subdue Serbia quickly. The opening days of the conflict revealed the limitations and assumptions of these pre-war plans. Germany's rapid invasion of Belgium met unexpectedly stiff resistance from the Belgian army, slowing the advance and giving France time to mobilize along the northeastern frontier. In parallel, British expeditionary forces began landing on French soil by mid-August, prepared to engage the advancing German armies. In the east, Russia's armies moved faster than German intelligence had anticipated, forcing Germany to divert troops to the Eastern Front to confront Russian advances in East Prussia. Diplomacy had failed utterly. Secret treaties, prearranged alliances, and miscommunications left little room for compromise. The French ambassador in Berlin, upon hearing of Germany's mobilization, appealed for negotiations, but the German military command ignored diplomatic channels, prioritizing execution of the Schlieffen Plan. Similarly, Austria-Hungary's insistence on punishing Serbia left the Russian leadership feeling compelled to act, as inaction would weaken its prestige and influence in the Balkans. Each power acted with the belief that hesitation would invite strategic disaster, but the result was a cascading series of war declarations: Austria-Hungary on Serbia, Germany on Russia and France, and Britain on Germany. By mid-August, Europe was fully engulfed. Battles erupted along multiple fronts, foreshadowing the scale of devastation to come. On August 12 to 13, 1914, Russian forces invaded East Prussia, while German armies pressed through Belgium and northern France. The First Battle of the Frontiers began in late August, encompassing several engagements along the French-German border. Casualties mounted rapidly, and both sides began to recognize the industrialized nature of the war: mass armies, rail-based mobilization, and the deadly efficiency of modern weapons. The human dimension of these early days cannot be overstated. Soldiers, many of whom were barely out of their teens, were swept into conflict with little understanding of the larger geopolitical stakes. Families across Europe awaited news, often delayed or incomplete, as telegrams carried word of skirmishes and losses. Political leaders, insulated by their offices, were already contemplating larger strategies, unaware that the war they had unleashed would far exceed their expectations. The optimism that a quick war would settle old scores proved tragically misplaced. One of the earliest miscalculations was the assumption that Russia would mobilize slowly. In reality, Russian rail networks, while less developed than Germany's, enabled substantial troop movement in just weeks. German commanders had anticipated 6 weeks for Russia to fully mobilize. The actual pace forced Germany to fight a war on 2 fronts almost immediately, testing the limits of their pre-war strategies. Simultaneously, Belgium's unexpected resistance and the rapid deployment of British forces slowed the German advance, undermining the initial timetable of the Schlieffen Plan and setting the stage for prolonged conflict. By the end of August 1914, Europe had transitioned from a tense powder keg into a fully fledged war zone. The initial enthusiasm of leaders and populations would soon give way to the grim realities of industrialized warfare. The promises of a quick, decisive victory evaporated as logistical challenges, stubborn resistance, and the mobilization of multiple nations ensured that the conflict would be far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The spark in Sarajevo had ignited a war that would engulf not only Europe but eventually the entire world, laying the foundations for the unprecedented scale of human suffering and societal upheaval that would define World War I. The events of July and August 1914 illustrate the deadly combination of alliances, militarized planning, and misperceived threats. Austria-Hungary's punitive ambitions, Germany's strategic rigidity, Russia's pan-Slavic solidarity, France's defense preparations, and Britain's treaty obligations collided to create a self-reinforcing cycle of escalation. Each nation believed it was acting defensively, yet the cumulative effect was the most destructive war the world had yet seen. In these weeks, the machinery of total war was set in motion, a war that would not end in weeks or months, but in years of attrition, devastation, and profound transformation. By the close of August 1914, Europe had crossed a threshold. The Schlieffen Plan had failed to deliver a rapid victory. Armies were entrenched along multiple fronts. Civilians were caught in the path of mobilization, and the full horror of industrialized warfare was beginning to unfold. The Great War had begun in earnest, propelled by a mixture of ambition, fear, and miscalculation, and Europe would never be the same again. By the autumn of 1914, the initial hopes for a short, decisive war had been shattered. The German advance through Belgium and northern France, meticulously planned under the Schlieffen Plan, had stalled. The rapid movement that German generals had anticipated had been slowed by unexpected Belgian resistance, the timely mobilization of French forces, and the arrival of the British Expeditionary Force, BF. The First Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6 to September 12, 1914, became the pivotal moment in the early weeks of the war. French and British forces, under the command of General Joseph Joffre, successfully halted the German advance just 40 miles from Paris. The German army was forced to retreat, abandoning the possibility of a quick victory in the West. This battle marked the transition from mobile warfare to a protracted stalemate along the Western Front. By late September, both sides began digging trenches, fortifying positions along a line that would extend roughly 440 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The trenches were more than mere ditches. They became a complex system of frontline, support, and reserve trenches, interspersed with barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements. The landscape of northern France and Belgium was transformed into a labyrinth of mud, rotting corpses, and disease-ridden living quarters. Life in the trenches was brutal and monotonous. Soldiers endured mud that soaked uniforms and boots, rats that carried disease, lice infestations that spread typhus, and the constant threat of artillery bombardments that could obliterate entire sections of the line within minutes. The over-the-top assaults were horrifyingly predictable. Soldiers climbed out of their trenches into no man's land, only to be mowed down by machine guns and artillery. Despite this, morale fluctuated as camaraderie, nationalism, and the belief in eventual victory sustained the troops. The letters home often revealed despair, fear, and the profound psychological toll of static warfare. While the Western Front was locked in a stalemate, the Eastern Front remained far more fluid. Germany and Austria-Hungary engaged the Russian Empire in a series of decisive early battles. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought from August 26 to August 30, 1914, resulted in a catastrophic defeat for Russia. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff encircled the Russian Second Army, capturing approximately 92,000 prisoners and killing or wounding tens of thousands more. This victory demonstrated the effectiveness of German operational planning and underscored Russia's logistical vulnerabilities. The subsequent First Battle of the Masurian Lakes in September further weakened Russian advances into East Prussia, though the Russians continued to engage in Galicia and along the Carpathian Mountains, forcing Austria-Hungary to divert troops from Serbia and other fronts. Amid these military developments, technology began to define the character of the war. The use of machine guns, heavy artillery, and rapid-fire rifles turned even minor engagements into bloodbaths. In late 1914, both sides began experimenting with chemical weapons, though large-scale use would only come later. Gas shells, first deployed by the French in small quantities, introduced a new dimension of horror to the battlefield, producing panic and slow, agonizing deaths in confined trench networks. Artillery, in particular, became the primary instrument of attrition, capable of destroying trenches, cutting barbed wire, and inflicting massive casualties over sustained bombardments. By early 1915, new weapons and tactics were being introduced to break the stalemate. Both sides developed poison gas, including chlorine and phosgene, which would be used extensively at battles such as the Second Battle of Ypres beginning on April 22, 1915. The Germans initiated the gas attack in Belgium, releasing chlorine gas from 5,700 cylinders, creating a lethal cloud that drifted into Allied lines. While the gas caused approximately 6,000 immediate casualties, including both deaths and injuries, the Allied forces quickly adapted with rudimentary gas masks, and the front stabilized once more. This event marked the beginning of chemical warfare as a defining and horrifying element of World War I. On the Western Front, battles such as the Race to the Sea from September to October 1914 exemplified the deadlock that would dominate the next 4 years. As both sides attempted to outflank each other, trenches extended farther northward, linking fortifications along the coast of Belgium. Casualties mounted without significant territorial gains, cementing the reality that industrialized warfare and entrenched positions would make rapid victories impossible. Soldiers contended not only with enemy fire, but also with disease, malnutrition, and exposure to harsh weather, while military planners struggled to find breakthroughs that could exploit weaknesses in the enemy lines. Meanwhile, the war was expanding globally. Austria-Hungary continued its campaign in the Balkans, invading Serbia in October 1914 in a series of offensives. Initial successes were met with fierce Serbian resistance, notably at the Battle of Sarajevo from August 15 to 24, 1914, where Serbian forces delivered the first Allied victory against the Central Powers. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Serbia's army managed to repel Austro-Hungarian forces, forcing a temporary retreat. The battles in the Balkans foreshadowed the extensive human cost and logistical complexity of fighting in multiple theaters simultaneously, a reality that would continue to challenge all belligerents throughout the war. Naval warfare also emerged as a crucial dimension of the conflict during this period. The British Royal Navy implemented a blockade of Germany designed to cut off supplies of food, fuel, and war materials. This blockade, which began in August 1914 and continued throughout the war, aimed to weaken Germany economically and psychologically, contributing to civilian hardships that would later influence political developments. Germany, in response, relied on its U-boat fleet to conduct submarine warfare, although unrestricted attacks on neutral shipping had not yet been fully implemented. Early encounters, such as the sinking of the British cruiser HMS Gloucester in 1914, foreshadowed the strategic importance of naval engagements in the broader conflict. The psychological impact of the war's early months on both soldiers and civilians cannot be overstated. Letters, diaries, and newspaper reports reveal a mixture of fear, boredom, and grim determination. Soldiers describe the monotonous cycles of digging, standing watch, repairing fortifications, and enduring artillery bombardments. The term trench foot became emblematic of the physical toll exacted by waterlogged trenches, while shell shock, though poorly understood at the time, began to emerge as a diagnosis for the mental trauma inflicted by relentless combat. Civilians faced food shortages, economic disruption, and the anxiety of waiting for news from the front. By the end of 1915, it was clear that the war had entered a protracted, industrialized phase. The stalemate along the Western Front would persist, punctuated by massive offensives that produced staggering casualties for minimal territorial gain. On the Eastern Front, Germany and Austro-Hungary had successfully repelled Russian incursions, but the war remained far from decided. The introduction of new technologies, including chemical weapons, heavy artillery, and coordinated infantry tactics, transformed battlefields into machines of destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. The conflict was no longer merely a contest of armies. It had become a war of attrition, in which human endurance and industrial capacity would determine outcomes. The early trench warfare of 1914 to 1915 laid the groundwork for the prolonged horrors that would define the Great War. It illustrated the deadly effectiveness of modern weapons, the logistical challenges of mobilizing millions of men across multiple fronts, and the immense human cost of strategic stalemate. Soldiers endured conditions that tested physical and mental limits, while commanders grappled with the difficulty of achieving decisive victories. Civilians across Europe witnessed the transformation of modern warfare into an all-encompassing, continent-wide catastrophe. In retrospect, the stalemate and trench warfare of 1914 to 1915 were not anomalies, but the inevitable result of technological, tactical, and strategic developments. The combination of industrial-scale weaponry, rigid mobilization plans, and entrenched positions ensured that traditional methods of rapid victory were obsolete. Europe had entered a war that would not only devastate armies and empires, but also leave an enduring legacy of suffering, resilience, and historical reflection. By 1915, World War I had already evolved from a European conflict into a global struggle, touching continents far beyond the initial theaters in Belgium, France, and the Balkans. The war's industrial scale, combined with the expansion of colonial empires, ensured that no corner of Europe's empires, or even the world, remained untouched. Both the Allies and the Central Powers sought to exploit their far-reaching influence, opening new fronts, targeting trade routes, and testing the resilience of nations unprepared for the full machinery of modern total war. One of the earliest examples of the war's global reach was the Gallipoli campaign, initiated on April 25, 1915. The Allies, particularly Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand, aimed to seize the Dardanelles Strait, open a maritime route to Russia, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The operation was designed as a swift, strategic maneuver, yet it quickly devolved into a nightmare. Allied forces faced fierce resistance from well-prepared Ottoman troops commanded by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. The campaign highlighted the lethal combination of modern weaponry and difficult terrain, steep ridges, fortified positions, and relentless artillery fire. Casualties mounted rapidly. Over 250,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing by the time the Allies evacuated in January 1916. The failure of Gallipoli underscored the challenge of amphibious warfare and demonstrated that even well-planned operations could falter against determined defenders. Meanwhile, at sea, Germany escalated its submarine warfare, signaling a shift in how global conflict would be waged. In early 1915, Germany adopted unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting Allied shipping to disrupt supply lines and weaken Britain economically. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915, became a defining moment. The passenger liner, torpedoed by a German U-boat, went down in 18 minutes, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. Public outrage in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere demonstrated how naval warfare now had profound political and diplomatic consequences. Germany suspended unrestricted attacks temporarily due to American pressure, yet the incident highlighted the interconnectedness of global trade, civilian risk, and military strategy. On the Western Front, the war of attrition intensified with battles of unprecedented scale. Verdun, one of the most iconic and harrowing engagements, began on February 21, 1916, and lasted until December 18, 1916. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn aimed to bleed France white by targeting a fortress of symbolic importance, forcing the French to commit enormous resources to defend it. French commanders, notably Philippe Pétain, organized a rotation system that kept troops relatively fresh, yet the human cost was staggering. Over 700,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing, transformed Verdun into a symbol of national resilience and human suffering. The battle also demonstrated the psychological toll of sustained bombardment and the limits of command in the face of industrialized firepower. Just months later, the Battle of the Somme, from July 1 to November 18, 1916, exemplified the industrialized slaughter of trench warfare. British and French forces launched the offensive in northern France, intending to relieve pressure on Verdun and break through German lines. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead, the bloodiest day in British military history. Artillery barges, intended to decimate German defenses, often failed to destroy deep bunkers or barbed wire, leading to mass casualties as infantry advanced across no man's land. By the battle's end, the Allies had gained only a few miles of territory at a cost of over 1 million men killed or wounded. The Somme became a grim testament to the mechanization of death and the inadequacy of traditional tactics against modern weaponry. Beyond the Western Front, other regions saw the war's expansion. In Italy, the entry into the conflict on May 23, 1915, on the side of the Allies against Austro-Hungary, opened a new front along the Isonzo River. The battles of the Isonzo, numbering 12 between 1915 and 1917, became notorious for mountainous terrain, logistical difficulties, and staggering casualties. The Italian army faced entrenched Austro-Hungarian positions, suffering enormous losses for minimal territorial gain. These secondary fronts revealed that the war's destructiveness was not confined to the famous Western and Eastern fronts. Every theater of combat exacted a devastating toll. The Ottoman Empire also became a major theater. Following Gallipoli, Allied forces engaged Ottoman troops in Mesopotamia, with the British targeting Baghdad to secure oil resources. Campaigns in East Africa, including German colonies such as German East Africa, modern Tanzania, saw protracted guerrilla-style engagements, combining local militias, colonial troops, and European officers. These theaters illustrated that World War I had evolved into a global contest for influence, resources, and strategic positioning far beyond Europe's borders. Technological innovation during 1915 to 1916 transformed warfare yet further. Poison gas, first deployed at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, became increasingly common. Chlorine and phosgene gases inflicted excruciating injuries and caused panic among unprepared troops. Artillery barges, often lasting days, destroyed terrain, obliterated villages, and created the pervasive no man's land environment that defined trench warfare. Tanks, still in their infancy, were first deployed by the British at the Somme in September 1916, representing a tentative step toward breaking the deadlock of entrenched positions. Meanwhile, aircraft shifted from reconnaissance roles to aerial combat, and limited bombing missions, heralding the arrival of air power as a strategic element in warfare. Amid these global expansions, civilian populations endured hardship and uncertainty. Food shortages, inflation, and displacement became common in occupied territories. In France and Belgium, entire villages were destroyed by artillery and occupation. The psychological impact on civilians, compounded by relentless news of casualty figures, contributed to societal strain that would later fuel political upheaval. Governments, meanwhile, used propaganda to sustain morale, emphasizing heroism, duty, and national survival, even as the scale of loss mounted. Naval engagements remained a decisive factor. The Battle of Jutland, though slightly later in 1916, was preceded by constant skirmishes and strategic blockades. Britain maintained a blockade intended to strangle Germany economically, while German U-boats threatened global shipping. This maritime dimension extended the war's impact to colonies, trade routes, and neutral nations, demonstrating that control of the seas was as crucial as control of land. Civilian casualties from submarine attacks underscored the globalized nature of the conflict, illustrating how the war blurred distinctions between military and civilian targets. By the end of 1916, the war had become an industrialized, total conflict that transcended traditional boundaries. The campaigns at Verdun, the Somme, Gallipoli, and the Isonzo, combined with global naval operations and colonial engagements, revealed that victory required not only battlefield success, but also economic resilience, technological innovation, and sustained national will. Millions of soldiers and civilians had already paid a horrific price, and the trajectory of the conflict suggested that the years ahead would demand even greater sacrifices. In retrospect, 1915 to 1916 marked a turning point in the scale and complexity of the war. Localized military objectives evolved into global strategies, industrial capacity, colonial resources, and technological innovation became as important as battlefield courage. The war had entered a phase in which attrition, supply lines, and coordination across continents were as decisive as tactical brilliance. This expansion confirmed that World War I was not merely a European war. It had become a truly global conflict, redefining warfare and the societies engaged in it. Nations were locked in a cycle of destruction and adaptation, with every front, Western, Eastern, Balkan, Italian, Ottoman, and colonial, shaping the overall outcome of the war. The human cost, staggering even by contemporary standards, underscored the unprecedented nature of the conflict. Soldiers endured unimaginable hardships in trenches, on mountains, and in deserts. Civilians faced displacement, starvation, and bombardment. Governments mobilized entire economies, while scientists and engineers developed increasingly deadly weapons. By the close of 1916, Europe and much of the world had been irrevocably changed. The promise of a short, decisive war had vanished. The stage was now set for the next phase: political upheaval, revolution, and the eventual entry of new powers into a conflict that had become both global and interminable. By 1917, the Great War had entered a phase of total exhaustion. Europe's major powers were drained economically, socially, and militarily. The human cost had already reached millions, yet the conflict showed no signs of abating. It was in this context that two transformative events, the Russian revolutions and the entry of the United States, would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war, tipping the balance in ways that could not have been foreseen in 1914. Russia, the largest of the Entente powers by both territory and population, had been struggling with the strains of modern warfare from the outset. The mobilization of the Russian army in 1914 exposed deep weaknesses in logistics, supply chains, and military leadership. Soldiers faced inadequate weapons, insufficient food, and poor training. These deficiencies became magnified by successive defeats at battles such as Tannenberg in August 1914 and the Masurian Lakes. By 1916, Russian morale had deteriorated sharply, compounded by shortages of food, clothing, and munitions on the home front. Civilian unrest grew as inflation soared, industrial production faltered, and the urban population faced severe deprivation. The tipping point came in March 1917, in what became known as the February Revolution, March 8 to 12, 1917, in the Gregorian calendar, which Russia adopted later that year. Strikes and demonstrations erupted in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, initially over bread shortages and poor working conditions. Soldiers, ordered to suppress the protests, increasingly mutinied, refusing to fire on civilians. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II on March 15, 1917, marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and over 3 centuries of autocratic rule. A provisional government was established under Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, committed to continuing the war alongside the Allies, a decision that would prove politically precarious and unpopular among an exhausted populace. While the provisional government struggled to maintain authority, a radical alternative was gaining strength. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who advocated for immediate withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land, and workers' control over production. Lenin's April Theses, delivered upon his return from exile on April 3, 1917, outlined these principles, promising peace, land, and bread to the war-weary masses. Russia's war effort faltered under the dual pressures of internal dissent and external military setbacks. By October 1917, November 7th in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, toppling the provisional government in Petrograd. This radical upheaval led to the negotiation of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, effectively removing Russia from the conflict and allowing Germany to redirect forces westward for a concentrated effort against France and Britain. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had maintained official neutrality throughout 1914 to 1916, though economic and material support for the Allies had been substantial. American public opinion initially favored isolationism, rooted in the desire to avoid entanglement in Europe's dynastic disputes. However, German policies increasingly strained relations. Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare on January 31, 1917, aimed at cutting off supplies to Britain and France, threatened neutral shipping, including American vessels. The sinking of ships such as the British freighter Housatonic and the torpedoing of the RMS Lusitania 2 years earlier had already inflamed public sentiment. But the unrestricted campaign of 1917 made conflict increasingly likely. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted and published by British intelligence in February 1917, further pushed the United States toward intervention. In the telegram, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico should the U.S. enter the war against Germany, promising the return of lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico. The revelation of this plot outraged the American public and Congress, framing the conflict as not merely European but directly threatening U.S. sovereignty and security. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany, entering the conflict on the side of the Allies. Though American forces would take months to mobilize fully, their economic and military contributions were immediate. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, commanded by General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in June 1917, initially numbering in the tens of thousands and growing rapidly throughout the year. The entry injected fresh manpower, resources, and morale into a war that had been bogged down by attrition, signaling a strategic shift that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Central Powers. The year 1917 also witnessed continued escalation and innovation in military strategy. On the Western Front, the Battle of Arras, April 9th to May 16th, 1917, and the Battle of Passchendaele, Third Battle of Ypres, July 31st to November 10th, 1917, exemplified the grueling nature of attrition warfare. British and Canadian forces faced mud-choked fields, relentless German artillery, and heavily fortified defensive positions. Despite minor territorial gains, casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, illustrating that even fresh troops and renewed resources could not guarantee decisive breakthroughs without innovation or coordination. These battles highlighted the emergence of combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, artillery, and emerging technologies such as tanks and aircraft, though success remained limited and costly. Naval warfare continued to play a critical role in 1917. The British Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany, now joined by increasingly coordinated efforts with the French and American navies. German U-boats continued to threaten Allied shipping, leading to the adoption of convoy systems in mid-1917 to protect merchant vessels. These convoys, escorted by warships, significantly reduced losses and ensured the continued flow of American troops and material to Europe, reinforcing the strategic importance of naval control in modern, industrialized conflict. Politically, the year 1917 also underscored the global consequences of domestic unrest. In addition to Russia's revolution, strikes, riots, and protests erupted in Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy, fueled by food shortages, inflation, and war weariness. Governments faced a dual challenge: maintaining the war effort while containing internal dissent. In Austria-Hungary, ethnic tensions continued to simmer, foreshadowing the eventual collapse of the empire. In Germany, political pressure from socialists and moderates grew as the war stretched into its fourth year, contributing to the destabilization of the Central Powers. The human cost of 1917 was staggering. Millions of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the civilian population increasingly felt the strain of total war. Food shortages, inflation, and disease afflicted cities and villages, while propaganda and censorship sought to maintain morale and suppress dissent. The psychological toll on soldiers, many facing prolonged exposure to trench warfare, gas attacks, and constant bombardment, was immense. Terms such as shell shock entered public consciousness, highlighting the mental and emotional dimensions of industrialized conflict. By the end of 1917, the world had irrevocably changed. Russia's exit from the war altered the strategic balance, freeing German forces for concentrated operations on the Western Front. The arrival of American troops and resources promised to tip the scales back in favor of the Allies, though their full impact would not be felt until 1918. The war's scope had expanded globally, from Europe to the Atlantic and beyond, affecting colonies, trade networks, and international relations. Civilian populations were as entangled in the conflict as soldiers, and the social, political, and economic structures of nations were being reshaped by the relentless demands of total war. In retrospect, 1917 stands as a pivotal year in World War I. The Russian revolutions and the withdrawal of a major Entente power demonstrated the fragility of empires under strain. The United States' entry exemplified the global dimensions of the conflict and the influence of economic, military, and ideological considerations on national decision-making. Battles such as Arras and Passchendaele illustrated the continuing horror of trench and industrialized warfare, while innovations in technology and tactics hinted at the evolving nature of combat. The convergence of domestic unrest, strategic necessity, and international intervention set the stage for the final phases of the war, when exhausted nations would confront not only external enemies, but internal crises that would reshape the post-war world. Ultimately, 1917 underscored the interconnectedness of global conflict. Decisions in Petrograd, Washington, Berlin, and London reverberated across continents. Revolutions, telegrams, and troop deployments were no longer isolated events. They were components of a vast, interconnected system of warfare that affected millions of lives and redrew political landscapes. By the close of the year, the foundations had been laid for the eventual collapse of empires, the redefinition of borders, and the social transformations that would follow the armistice of 1918. By the dawn of 1918, the Great War had reached a critical inflection point. For years of industrialized slaughter had left Europe exhausted, with millions dead, economies strained, and societies teetering on the edge of collapse. The Russian exit from the war, formalized with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, had freed Germany to redirect its focus entirely to the Western Front. With hundreds of thousands of fresh troops and material now available, German military planners believed that victory was still within reach before the full weight of American forces could tip the balance in favor of the Allies. The German strategy, known as the Spring Offensive or Kaiserschlacht, commenced on March 21, 1918, with Operation Michael. Under the command of General Erich Ludendorff, the Germans aimed to break through the Allied lines between the British 3rd and 5th Armies in northern France. Using a combination of infiltration tactics, stormtrooper units, and concentrated artillery, German forces initially achieved unprecedented success, advancing up to 65 kilometers in some sectors. These early gains, however, came at a staggering human cost. British casualties alone in the opening days numbered over 120,000, and the Germans themselves suffered immense losses that would undermine the sustainability of the offensive. Operation Michael was followed by successive offensives: Operation Georgette in Flanders, Operation Blücherjörg towards the Marne, and Operation Gneisenau in Champagne, each designed to exploit weaknesses in the overstretched Allied lines. For a brief moment, it seemed that Germany could achieve a decisive breakthrough and force the Allies to negotiate. Yet, logistical difficulties, exhaustion, and the increasingly effective defensive measures of the Allies slowed the advance. The use of combined arms, including artillery barges, machine gun nests, and hastily deployed reserves, began to blunt the German momentum, while the arrival of fresh American troops strengthened the Allied position. By July 1918, the tide had begun to turn decisively. The Allies launched the Second Battle of the Marne, July 15th to August 6th, marking the beginning of a sustained counteroffensive that would push German forces back across previously conquered territory. Under the command of French General Ferdinand Foch, Allied forces, including American, French, and British units, coordinated attacks using reserves strategically placed behind the front lines. The German army, despite initial successes, was now suffering from dwindling manpower, shortages of supplies, and declining morale. Desertion rates increased, and the psychological strain of relentless combat eroded cohesion. The counteroffensive demonstrated the growing effectiveness of coalition warfare, in which coordination, intelligence, and combined logistics could overcome the previously dominant German tactical innovations. The collapse of Germany's allies further accelerated the unraveling of the Central Powers. In late October 1918, Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29, 1918, effectively exiting the war after facing sustained offensives in the Balkans and internal political upheaval. The Ottoman Empire battered on multiple fronts, including the British-led campaigns in Palestine, and Mesopotamia followed with an armistice on October 30, 1918, surrendering control of much of its territory. Austro-Hungary, beset by ethnic fragmentation, food shortages, and mutinous troops, disintegrated rapidly. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes declared independence, and Emperor Charles I fled Vienna in early November. The chain reaction of political collapse left Germany increasingly isolated, both militarily and diplomatically. The German home front mirrored the crisis on the battlefield. Food shortages, inflation, and widespread discontent fueled strikes and protests in cities such as Berlin, Kiel, and Hamburg. The Kiel Mutiny in late October 1918 saw sailors revolt against orders for a final, suicidal naval engagement. Negotiations culminated on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. Representatives of the German High Command, including Matthias Erzberger, met with Allied commanders to sign the Armistice of Compiègne, bringing an end to hostilities on the Western Front. The armistice stipulated the cessation of all fighting, the withdrawal of German troops behind the Rhine, the surrender of heavy weapons, and the release of prisoners. The guns fell silent after more than 4 years of relentless combat that had claimed over 16 million lives, with millions more wounded, missing, or permanently scarred physically and psychologically. The human cost of the final year of the war was staggering. Casualties from the spring offensive and subsequent Allied counterattacks were immense. German forces alone suffered approximately 1.8 million casualties between March and November 1918. Allied losses were also significant. The French army lost roughly 1.4 million soldiers, the British around 880,000, and American forces, although entering the war late, suffered nearly 117,000 casualties in 1918 alone. Beyond the battlefield, civilians in Europe faced widespread deprivation, disease, and displacement. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 compounded these hardships, killing tens of millions worldwide and leaving survivors to confront devastation on both personal and societal levels. The collapse of empires and the signing of the armistice set the stage for dramatic geopolitical changes. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist as a unified state, giving rise to multiple independent nations, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened, faced partitioning and foreign occupation, with significant implications for the Middle East. Germany, forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, faced not only territorial losses but the psychological and political trauma of military defeat. The map of Europe had been redrawn, ethnic and national boundaries reconfigured, and centuries-old empires reduced to historical memory. The armistice, however, was not a final peace but a fragile cessation of hostilities. Negotiations would continue into 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed punitive terms on Germany, including reparations, military limitations, and territorial concessions. These conditions, combined with the humiliation of defeat, fostered political instability in Germany and sowed the seeds for future conflict. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire created power vacuums and territorial disputes that would challenge post-war diplomacy. Yet, in November 1918, amid exhaustion and relief, the immediate priority was the cessation of fighting, the return of soldiers to their homes, and the tentative reconstruction of societies devastated by 4 years of war. The war's end in 1918 also highlighted the transformation of warfare itself. Industrialization, mass conscription, technological innovation, and total mobilization had fundamentally altered the scale and nature of conflict. Trench warfare, chemical weapons, machine guns, heavy artillery, tanks, and aircraft had redefined the human experience of battle. Civilians were now direct participants in the war effort, and the economies, politics, and cultures of nations were shaped by the demands of sustained total war. The collapse of empires in 1918 was not merely a military phenomenon. It reflected the convergence of political, social, and economic pressures, magnified by unprecedented levels of violence and destruction. In retrospect, the events of 1918 were both the culmination of years of grinding conflict and the beginning of a new global order. The armistice did not erase the scars of the battlefield, the social upheavals, or the political crises that had emerged across Europe and the wider world. Instead, it marked the fragile pause between one epoch of devastation and the uncertain attempts at reconstruction. The collapse of empires demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most entrenched powers, while the armistice underscored the human capacity for endurance, negotiation, and adaptation in the face of overwhelming adversity. As Europe and the world attempted to come to terms with the scale of the catastrophe, the legacy of 1918 reverberated across continents. Societies faced the monumental task of integrating returning soldiers, rebuilding infrastructure, and coping with the political, economic, and cultural consequences of total war. The lessons of collapse, revolution, and armistice would resonate through the interwar period, influencing diplomacy, military doctrine, and the fragile pursuit of lasting peace. The Great War had ended, but its shadows, political instability, social unrest, and unresolved tensions would haunt the 20th century for decades to come. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, yet the echoes of World War I reverberated far beyond the battlefield. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had left Europe physically and psychologically scarred, economies shattered, and empires dismantled. Yet the cessation of hostilities was merely the beginning of a new struggle. The painstaking, often chaotic task of constructing a post-war order that could prevent the recurrence of such devastation. The period from 1919 into the 1920s was marked by political upheaval, social transformation, economic reconstruction, and the redrawing of borders, a world fundamentally remade in the aftermath of unprecedented catastrophe. The centerpiece of post-war diplomacy was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Negotiated primarily by the victorious Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and Italy, the treaty imposed harsh terms on Germany, intended to ensure accountability, prevent future aggression, and compensate for the immense destruction wrought across Europe. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, pay reparations estimated initially at 132 billion gold marks, and cede territory to Belgium, France, Alsace-Lorraine, Denmark, Northern Schleswig, and Poland, the Polish corridor. The German military was limited to 100,000 men, prohibited from possessing tanks, heavy artillery, or an air force, and the Rhineland was to be demilitarized. The treaty's punitive nature would sow political resentment, economic strain, and nationalist agitation that reverberated for decades. Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were formally dismantled, giving rise to a cascade of new nations and mandates. Austria and Hungary became independent republics, while Czechoslovakia emerged from the Czech lands and Slovakia. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, united South Slavic peoples under a single monarchy, although ethnic tensions would persist. The Ottoman Empire's Middle Eastern territories were partitioned under the League of Nations mandates. Britain administered Iraq and Palestine, while France oversaw Syria and Lebanon. These border redrawings, designed to reflect strategic interests rather than historical or ethnic realities, laid the groundwork for long-term instability in Europe and the Middle East. In the midst of these geopolitical transformations, the League of Nations was established in January 1920, following the principles outlined in U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Intended as a mechanism to resolve international disputes, prevent aggression, and promote collective security, the League embodied an idealistic vision of diplomacy. Yet it faced immediate limitations. The United States, despite Wilson's central role in its conception, refused to join following Senate opposition. The League struggled to enforce its mandates, mediate conflicts, or deter aggression, foreshadowing the diplomatic failures that would contribute to World War II. The social consequences of the war were profound. Millions of men had been killed, wounded, or permanently disabled, leaving societies with stark gender imbalances and a psychological toll that would echo through generations. In many countries, women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles in factories, hospitals, and government offices left vacant by men at the front. By 1919, suffrage movements achieved historic victories. Women gained the right to vote in Britain. Representation of the People Act February 6, 1918 for women over 30. Full equal suffrage in 1928. The United States, 19th Amendment ratified August 18, 1920, and Germany, November 12, 1918. These transformations marked a profound shift in societal structures and expectations, signaling that the war had not only altered geopolitics, but also social hierarchies. Economic reconstruction was an immense challenge. Infrastructure across France, Belgium, and northern Italy had been destroyed, factories demolished, and agricultural production disrupted. Germany faced hyperinflation in the early 1920s, exacerbated by reparations obligations, which eroded savings, destabilized politics, and fueled social unrest. Governments implemented policies of reconstruction, industrial modernization, and financial stabilization, often with the aid of foreign loans. In France, the occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 by French and Belgian forces, aimed at securing reparations, reflected both the economic tensions and the fragility of post-war recovery. Across Europe, reconstruction efforts were uneven, leaving large swaths of the population impoverished and politically disillusioned. Politically, the post-war period saw the rise of radical ideologies as societies grappled with the trauma of total war. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 established a communist state, inspiring socialist and communist movements across Europe. In Germany, the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was violently suppressed. While the fledgling Weimar Republic struggled to establish legitimacy amid inflation, political extremism, and resentment over Versailles. Italy faced the rise of Benito Mussolini and fascism, exploiting social unrest and dissatisfaction with territorial settlements. These ideological shifts reflected the broader societal search for stability and meaning in a world profoundly altered by unprecedented destruction. The war's legacy also extended to colonial territories. European powers had relied heavily on colonial troops from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. After the war, these soldiers often returned home with heightened expectations of political recognition and social reform. In India, Egypt, and French West Africa, veterans and intellectuals began to challenge colonial hierarchies, laying the groundwork for nationalist movements that would reshape global politics in the decades to follow. The experience of global conflict, combined with promises of post-war reform, fueled anti-colonial sentiment and aspirations for self-determination. Culturally, the impact of World War I was equally profound. Literature, art, and philosophy reflected the disillusionment and trauma of a generation. Writers such as Erich Maria Remarque, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen captured the horrors of trench warfare and the human cost of industrialized combat. Artists, particularly in Germany, France, and Britain, embraced movements such as Dadaism and Expressionism, seeking to express the fragmentation, absurdity, and despair of a world destabilized by conflict. These cultural responses were both cathartic and revolutionary, shaping the intellectual and artistic climate of the 1920s. Internationally, the post-war settlement attempted to balance power and prevent future conflicts, yet it sowed the seeds of new tensions. The reconfiguration of Central and Eastern Europe, the punitive treatment of Germany, and the creation of mandates in the Middle East generated grievances and disputes that would erupt in later conflicts. While the League of Nations represented an unprecedented attempt at collective security, its structural weaknesses, combined with the absence of major powers, limited its efficacy. Nevertheless, the post-war period marked the first sustained international effort to institutionalize diplomacy and codify mechanisms for conflict resolution on a global scale. By the mid-1920s, Europe had begun to stabilize, yet the scars of war remained visible. Urban centers bore the ruins of industrialized combat, monuments commemorated the fallen, and memorials dotted the landscapes of the Western Front. Societies wrestled with the psychological aftermath of mass death, the displacement of populations, and the integration of veterans into civilian life. Technological and industrial advancements, accelerated by wartime necessity, contributed to economic recovery and modernization. Yet the shadow of conflict lingered in politics, culture, and collective memory. In conclusion, the aftermath of World War I transformed the world in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Treaty of Versailles, the dissolution of empires, and the redrawing of borders created a new political landscape, while social change, economic reconstruction, and cultural reflection reshaped societies from Europe to the colonies. Ideologies, communism, fascism, and nationalism rose in response to war-induced dislocation, setting the stage for further upheaval in the decades to come. Women's suffrage, technological progress, and global awareness reflected a world irrevocably altered. The war had ended with silence, but its consequences would reverberate for generations, influencing geopolitics, society, and culture throughout the 20th century. World War I was, in the end, not just a military conflict, but a crucible of transformation. It demonstrated the fragility of empires, the resilience of societies, and the profound human cost of industrialized warfare. The post-war world, though attempting to recover and rebuild, was marked by the tensions, ideologies, and unresolved grievances that would continue to shape global history. By examining the years 1919 into the 1920s, we see a world struggling to learn from catastrophe, negotiating the delicate balance between memory and reconstruction, and confronting the enduring consequences of the first truly global industrial conflict.